Can you unshare now, Sophie? Ready to go, Peter.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Sussex Development Lecture of 2022. And best wishes from us all here to everyone as we start this new year, although we are already rapidly approaching the end of January. It's really good to have an opportunity again to come together for another installment in this series of lectures where the overarching theme is around uncertainty. And today's Sussex Development Lecture is around mining minerals, uncertainties caused by global energy transitions. A very important topic, and one that I think is going to generate some really interesting ideas and some stimulating discussions. And we're looking forward in a moment to hearing from our three presenters who I'll introduce shortly. So just before I introduce, my name is Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at IDS. And a few housekeeping comments. If you're on Twitter, we'd encourage you to tweet about today's lecture using #SussexDev. We will have around 45 minutes for the conversation with our three speakers. And then after that, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So please put any questions you'd like to ask in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And also, we have a closed captions facility available on Zoom. If you'd find that helpful, please select the CC button from the Zoom menu at the bottom of the screen, and that will enable you to see the captions as the presenters are speaking. So we'll get started. This is a very important topic because clearly it's really crucial to think about the role of minerals in tackling climate change, the tensions between economic development and social justice, and the rising conflicts between mining projects and social activist movements. And so today we are going to move into a conversation that's hosted by my colleague Annabelle Marin, who is an IDS Research Fellow, and she leads the Business, Markets and the State Cluster at IDS. She's also chair of the Global Network for Open Source Seed Initiatives, and she's director of BioLeft, which is an open source initiative for seed breeding. And she's interested in the linkages between business, policies, and sustainable development, and brings more than 20 years' experience in research, support to science and technology, innovation, trade and environmental policies, and activism. Then we will be hearing from Peter Newell, who is Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex. He's previously worked on climate change and energy, agricultural biotechnology, corporate accountability, and trade policy in a number of countries. And in recent years, his research has mainly focused on the political economy of carbon markets and low carbon energy transitions. And we also have Mariana Walter, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's an environmental scientist working on ecological economics and political ecology, and she's interested in resource extraction, conflicts, environmental justice, knowledge co-production, and institutional change. So, welcome to our three panelists. I'm going to hand over now to Annabelle, who is going to manage the conversation. And then after we've had the rounds of input and also some summing up remarks from Annabelle, we'll be opening it up for questions and answers and discussion. So again, do please use the chat function to put in any questions or comments that you have. And we should have a good 45 minutes at the end in order to have a good engagement with our panelists. So, Annabelle, over to you.
Okay. So I will share my screen. Thank you. Let me know if you can see it. Yeah?
Yeah, that's clear.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for being here. Welcome. And okay, with this introduction, I would just clarify that what we will present today here is not a paper, or the results of a research project. Is more a result of a common interest between us. And a common motivation for promoting changes. So we will be discussing more than anything else problems, which problems we see, and also questions. And so the idea is that we can then discuss to hear your reactions and discuss with you what we see as the main problems and questions in relation to this topic. So I will start the presentation with presenting some facts, some numbers that show the magnitude of the problem. Then we'll discuss very briefly the interlinked challenges from a global and a domestic perspective, from the perspective of low and middle income countries that are reaching mineral resources. And then I will give the word to Peter and Mariana to address, to go deeper into the issue of the global challenges and domestic tensions and challenges from the point of view of middle and low income countries. And then finally I will again talk after the interventions of Peter and Mariana about the linkages between these tensions and the conflicts that we have discussed and the possibilities of transformation. And so, for example, which kind of the transformations, these tensions might be facilitating, which are the questions that we should be looking at in relation to these transformations, which are the approaches that we should be using. And so this is something that we have been thinking about for some time now, with interest in developing a project. And this is the results of a collective work that I have been doing with many colleagues, among which is Mariana, Peter, but also Daniel Goya might be here, and other colleagues that have been working with us on this issue. So, starting with the facts and with introduction. So we have been very clear signals recently. We have seen very clear signals that the energy transition might be finally starting to happen. And this is, of course, is good news, but we also have started to see some very clear signs of a problem, that is that this energy transition will require huge amounts of minerals, and that these minerals might be, some of the critical minerals that will be required might be far scarcer than, for example, petroleum, and more unevenly distributed across countries. This is just a graph that shows the contrast between, for example, just as an example, what is required for producing an electric car compared to a conventional car. And these are estimations done by the International Energy Agency. So the estimations about demand, what they are showing is, these are all estimations, of course, with different possible scenarios, but they are showing that the increases can be of at least 4 times in the more conservative scenarios in the demand for critical minerals. And for some of them, we can see that the estimations show even higher increases in demand, like, for example, for lithium or graphite that will be used for energy storage. So this is alerting us about 2 big uncertainties. One of them is, and these are very much interlinked. From a global perspective, is this big question of, can the production system, the world production system as it is now, satisfy this increase in demand? And the second is, what is going to be the net impact in sustainability when we add the global and the local impact of the increase in the extraction of minerals that will be required? And these two, maybe the first one seems a more obvious challenge, but the second is equally important, and they are both equally very much interconnected, particularly if we think about transitions in terms of justice. So why the production is what is creating concern, or why is creating concern? Well, the existing production capacity is not enough for the projected requirements. So, for example, just to take an example, for lithium, it will only cover 50% of the projected increases in demand. And the particularity of mining projects that they take a long time to develop, about 8 and 16 years. So this is a big issue. And in many of the countries where their facilities are already in place, the grades, the productivity is already very low. So this is the main issue. But then the second one is that many of these critical minerals are concentrated in a few countries, many of which are middle and low income countries. So there are big concerns about what might happen with the supplies of these minerals. This is just a graph that shows the concentration of some of the minerals. But then the second big challenge is that it has to do with the sustainability impact of this increase in the demand of minerals. From a global perspective, if it's poorly managed, of course, the mining activity, it's not very clear what will be the net impact, but this is being, in a way, addressed. But the second issue is that it will clearly create more development tensions for the countries, the low and middle income countries that are rich in mineral resources. These tensions are already there in place, but so the question and the uncertainty is about how much they will increase and the shape that they might take. We have the situation that many high, middle and low income countries are already very dependent on minerals. Like around 19 countries are already have more than 50% of their exports explained by buying minerals only, and 18 between 30 and 50% of their exports are completely explained by minerals. For these countries, policymakers are, of course, perceiving this increasing demand for minerals as an opportunity for incrementing economic outputs. In the short term, like more exports, fiscal revenues, and in the medium term, they are looking at the kind of linkages that these mining activities might be generating. So what we have started to see already is that mining projects are receiving a big push in many countries. But these mining activities are also bringing significant environmental and social problems as they are increasing. And just to mention some: pollution of soil and air, water resources, contamination of water, health risks, and so on. So what we have seen very recently is that social and environmental conflicts associated to mining are becoming more visible on the one hand, but also are being more effective in terms of limiting the possibilities of the governments in pushing for this project. So what I will do now is leave it for Mariana and Peter. Peter first, to talk a little bit more about these challenges, and then I will come back to try to link these two ideas of transformation and transition and transformation. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much, Annabelle. So Annabelle's given us this overview of some of these key trends, I guess, towards increased minerals extraction, which is clearly intensifying as a global phenomenon in debates about sustainability. But as she's also suggested, I think there's a big development challenge here, since I think it's 35 of the countries that are most dependent on mining. Of those 35, all but Australia and South Korea are developing countries. So it's intensifying some of these development challenges and the dependencies that Annabelle was just alluding to. So she's asked me to say a few words about putting this discussion around minerals in a broader global context of energy transition and how it relates to this mineral boom which we're seeing. And of course, that's both on land, which I guess is where the focus often lies, but also under the sea, right, as a new frontier of conflict for things like manganese nodules and nickel and some of these other minerals that we're talking about. And there's a long sort of prehistory, if you like, of that, legal controversies around access to those resources and how any revenues that they generate should be shared between countries, given that there's uneven access to extracting them. And this is a controversy that's run through the International Seabed Authority, for example, which regulates activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it's actually already issued, I think when I last looked, it's around 29 contracts for the exploration of deep sea mineral deposits. And an area roughly the size of Mongolia has been set aside for mineral exploration in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and along the mid-Atlantic ridge. But this exploration may also soon be giving way to exploitation. because mining in international waters is expected to commence within a few years and possibly as early as 2025. So we talk about the land stuff, but also the mining below the sea, I think, is going to become a new critical frontier in resource conflict. So in terms of how we make sense of all this, I guess on one level, it's largely about economics and technology, this drive to electrification that Annabelle was talking about. The huge demand for batteries and battery storage for anything from cooking to transportation to heating, as well as use in solar panels and wind turbines. And of course, this is aided by demands on the generation side and the falling price of renewable energy technologies, particularly wind and solar, and rising demand from them the world over, which in turn is part of a bigger story, of course, around the need to radically decarbonize the economy if we're to get anywhere near the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement and keep the world on track to 2 or 1.5 degrees warming. So that provides us with the momentum and the desire to scale and accelerate these transitions, which is pushing up against these new frontiers. It's not the only driver, but of course it's one of the drivers. But what I want to sort of reflect on a bit more in these few minutes that I have is around some of the deeper political issues and challenges that I think that emerge here. Because for me, one of the problems is around the dominant framing about how we decarbonize the economy. And it runs a risk, in my view, and I think we'll see evidence of this in a moment from Mariana, that it's intensifying and reinforcing existing modes of extractivism and potentially deepening existing inequalities, because those modes of extraction depend on very uneven relations of social and ecological exchange. And I mean that both within countries and between countries. And obviously in most places, there's obviously longer, often colonial histories in terms of who captures the value, but also who's expected to make the sacrifice for that extraction and for the capturing of that value. And so I'd see it, and this is sort of, using political economy language a little bit, that we're seeing these spatial and temporal fixes being used to try and go for the short-term fix rather than deal with the source of the problem in relation to climate change, which is obviously around the overuse of fossil fuels, and particularly by richer countries in the global north, but increasingly elsewhere too. And one of those is about passing costs on to future generations. So we're seeing this with the long time frames that governments are using when they talk about net zero, 2050, 2070. But it's also around mining, perhaps, around the issue of who lives with the effects and the legacies of this intensified wave of resource depletion that we look set to embark on. But we're also seeing this process of outsourcing problems, so that transitions are only low carbon in some parts of the world, perhaps richer parts of the world, where we are at the moment, in the UK at least, because they are high carbon elsewhere. And so this is the phenomena of embedded or virtual carbon, that's embodied and embedded in the goods that we're importing from overseas, that embody a lot of these minerals and processes that we're talking about. Or in some cases, of course, it's just blatant displacement, and we're seeing this with the huge rise of offset projects to try and achieve some of these ambitious goals. So I guess my argument is we need to think globally about the costs of transitions and how they're distributed within and between societies. And recent work by colleagues across Sussex, Ben Sovacour over in SPRU, or Daniela Soto in Global Studies, drawing, of course, on this long history of work on environmental justice, showing that there's often racial or class or gender dynamics which shape uneven exposure to harm from the mineral boom, but also socially differentiated access to the benefits and who's capturing some of the gains from this. And you can think about this clearly in terms of the additional burden that indigenous peoples are being asked to shoulder as these resource frontiers expand. And so if we think about it more broadly, who's paying for net zero and the upping of ambition here, and the use of these spatial and temporal fixes that I've been talking about? Because the key issue really here is land, which the minerals lie beneath, and where there are competing demands about its use. Like, everyone is trying to project competing values onto that land. We want it for food, we want it for energy, we want it for other sources of production and consumption. And so energy transitions and the drive towards them immediately gets deeply locked into and embedded and embroiled within the politics of land access and ownership and its unequal distribution. So, for example, whose land are we imagining will be set aside to enable richer countries and governments to absorb all this carbon, for example. So this isn't about mining per se, but it is about this issue of land and what it's used for, and on whose terms. Recent analysis by Oxfam, for example, showing how some of the net zero commitments of the 4 largest oil and gas corporations, BP, ENI, Shell, Total Energies, they're forecasting an area of land equivalent to more than twice the size of the UK in order to achieve their net zero objectives. The oil company Shell alone would require a land size the size of Honduras by 2030 to fulfill its obligations. So a lot of these commitments, declarations, they just don't add up in terms of where is all this land going to come from to meet these net zero promises. And of course, the same is true around the mining that we're focusing on today. And of course, what it does is take the pressure off richer countries to have to deal with their own emissions at source. It's moving the problem around and moving it elsewhere. And what it's also doing, of course, is that developing countries, as they will be expected to use that land for their own purposes and their own carbon sinks at some point, will no longer have that land available potentially if it's already being used for these other purposes. Another interesting global dynamic that I think we're observing is around how resistance to minerals mining in some parts of the world, and I'm thinking here things like some of the protests we've seen recently in Serbia around lithium mining there, may make it more attractive to do it elsewhere. I wonder if there's a link between successful projects to keep it out of European contexts, and then expand them in places like the lithium triangle between Argentina, Chile and Bolivia, for example. So there's this sort of, the location sites are being contested between different countries. But I think this really isn't about north-south. We're seeing also how the notion of green mining, which is a contested term, is being used to resuscitate old mining sites. So even in this country, in the UK, you're seeing lithium prospecting in Cornwall, where once it was all about tin and copper. And so it's about poverty and inequality, which of course are related to class, race and gender, as much as, and as well as the sort of north-south dynamics that we're talking about. And so for me, this suggests the need for this sort of global solidarities, and Mariana might talk about this in a moment, about the impact that resistance movements have had in trying to suspend or cancel or delay some of these more damaging prospects. But we also need to think about the ecological flows that are associated with these transitions going on in different parts of the world, because it is about the life course of minerals and the technologies they're used in, and the waste economies, particularly the e-waste that often results from the end products of some of these things that are being produced, as well as, of course, the energy embodied in them. Now, of course, this is where technology and innovation can make a big difference to discussions about improving the life cycle and the length of the duration, if you like, of battery use, recycling, repurposing. People are talking about green steel through hydrogen, etc., controversially in some cases. But clearly we need to think much more systematically about reducing demand for those minerals in the first place. Because my concern, I guess, is that if we carry on with this more conventional framing of decarbonisation, you might get pockets of delinking in specific sectors in particular moments of time, but you won't bend the overall emissions curve, because some of the savings that will be made will just get reinvested in more consumption and will outdo the effects of those incremental gains. So for me, this suggests the need to think a bit more critically as we engaged both as academics, but politically with this question of transitions. And it doesn't do away with the need to just criticize any project or any intervention. I think we need to try and understand and appreciate and engage with some of the live and real dilemmas around energy pathways. Because for me, in the end, there's no such thing as clean energy or green mining. There's just cleaner energy or greener mining. It's a relative concept, and we need to think about some of the issues Annabelle's raised around, regulation and transparency and so on. Because we're mining minerals for everyday goods, right? I mean, whether it's titanium for bikes, for surgical instruments, copper for cables, minerals for toothpaste, really mundane everyday products. It's not just about the rare earth minerals that are often the focus of the debate. So some element of mining is almost inevitable. The question is, how can we reduce the need for it? How can we minimize the impacts? And be more attentive to where it occurs and who benefits from it, because there is a concern in this debate. What we set an impossibly high barrier for minerals for renewables. And it's a standard that's not being applied to mining that's going on in other sectors. And of course, the fossil fuel industry is delighted about this. So let me just wrap up by talking about how we might move towards more just transitions, because that's another important part of the context here, because it opens up these questions about just for whom and how, and who gets to decide who benefits, if anyone, from this new wave of extractivism, and how. In other words, is there any meaningful citizen engagement in these sorts of deliberations I'm describing over competing energy paths? Traditionally not, right? Because energy is a very closed, high political area, big concerns about commercial confidentiality, very powerful actors, and there's reluctance to have transparency and citizen engagement around those things. We're also, here we're talking about sustainability perhaps, but also energy poverty and energy security, as we're seeing here in Europe around concerns around gas from Russia, are also live concerns and need to be part of these conversations around just transitions. And this is one of the issues with colleagues at IDS actually, that we're trying to think about in relation to transitions out of oil and gas in Nigeria, Mozambique and Kenya. What is the role of citizen engagement in there? And what does the closing of civic space mean for our ability to have these really difficult conversations, and to try and enhance, procedural and distributional justice? Because that's the only way for me that will deal with some of the problems that Annabelle was alluding to, the land grabs, the violent dispossession, the environmental effects, the labor conditions, all of those sorts of problems that need to be addressed. So I think, just to conclude, I think we need to move beyond this sort of narrower conversation about transition, which is just trying to replace one technology for another, to think a bit more about deeper transformations. And maybe that's something that Annabelle will come on to. So it's moving beyond what I would call a plug and play approach, where you just plug in a different technology, but everything else stays the same, to try and unsettle some of the deeper inequalities and power relations that surround it. So for me, then, the minerals discussion should be an entry point for rethinking a bit more profoundly, hopefully, destructive economies. And I'll stop there and hand on to Mariana.
Thank you, Peter. Great presentation. It's now difficult for me to add to all this beautiful overview that you have shared with us. Let me share screen. I have some presentation where I want to share some of the insights. Sorry, it's not my computer. And see here. Oh God, sorry. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Annabelle and the organizers of these Sussex Development Lectures for inviting me to share with you some of the insights that we are researching at the Environmental Justice Atlas. I am part of the Environmental Justice Atlas, of the direction and coordination team that guides this initiative that maybe some of you know. So I want to show you some of the research we are doing with the Atlas and some insights that I think are interesting to add to this conversation we are having today. So I don't know if you know the Atlas. I think some of you have visited the site and have some knowledge of this. This is an online platform that was created with a large project and launched in 2014. It was created with a network of research institutions and social movements working on environmental conflicts globally. And when it was launched, it had 500 cases, and nowadays this is a database with more than 3,600 cases, with conflicts that are categorized by 6 different categories that I will show you now, but that allow to document all these struggles that are happening in relation to mining, but also renewable energies, conservation, nuclear infrastructures, and I will show you now the categories. But it is an ongoing process. So you will see that some areas of the Atlas maybe look empty. This does not mean that there's no conflict there, but it means that it has been more difficult for us to reach and document those conflicts. But we are now actually facing the challenge of improving the coverage in areas like Asia, Middle East, and Central Europe, and so on. So this is an open process. And if you think that you want to collaborate with us, mapping conflicts, actually you can contact us and help us improve the coverage of the atlas. So this is an invitation also to explore the atlas. As you can see here on the right, there is a filter. You can actually define your own criteria to see what conflicts appear in the atlas according to commodities, to the outcomes of conflicts. You can explore and build your own search and see what type of conflicts you find. So I will go through some of the publications and research we have done and highlighting some interesting facts and some insights from our research. First, I would like to mention this analysis we conducted on the whole database that we published in 2020, where we analyzed 2,743 cases to research and see the profile of the conflicts we had mapped and what was happening with the environmental defenders, who they were, what type of strategies they were mobilizing. And what I want to show, there's something. This is, okay. So this cheese that you see here shows the different categories. Sorry, there's something missing in the presentation. So you can see the different categories of conflicts, like the black one, this category that you don't see the name is energy and renewable energies and different energy conflicts, related conflicts. The light brown on the top, that is the most conflictive activities, mining activities. The darker brown on the bottom has to do with land use and biomass conflicts. And then you have the blue one, which is water management, mainly dams, the gray one, which is infrastructures, and these include energy transitions lines and so on. So what I wanted to show you with this, and on the right you have actually the number of killings, the different type of conflicts where there has been more violence toward environmental defenders. And what you can see is that actually mining and agribusiness are the most violent activities. Mining being the most conflictive activity and the most violent activity. This is consistent with the Global Witness reports as well in terms of violence toward environmental defenders. But what I wanted to point with this global overview of the Atlas is that the most conflictive activities we have in the Atlas are actually key activities in the energy transition scenarios, being mining, being energy, renewable energy. The energy entry includes low and high carbon energy sources. And also you have dams, and also you have across the categories you can find different conflicts, but mining and energy are the most conflictive categories of the Atlas. I don't want to go into this, but this has also to do with something that Peter Newell was mentioning before. I think it's very interesting, and there's many publications coming out on this, how low carbon energy projects are also very conflictive across the world. And there's lots of research pointing this, and this is a research we did comparing conflicts in the Atlas related to low and high energy projects. And we analyzed different trends regarding violence and so on. But this also has to do with land use. So we are going through these energy transition scenarios are pushing different activities at high land use demand. And I wanted very quickly to invite you to visit this publication if you're interested. So about mining, what can we learn from the Atlas about mining conflicts and mining and challenges related to mining, but also what can we learn from the Atlas about the role that environmental justice movements or environmental defenders have pushing for new narratives, new transformation fostering institutional change, challenging mining governance, and maybe creating new ways of thinking about what scenarios can look like. So I want to show you some recent research. I put this slide that Annabelle did a great presentation, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that what actually Annabelle pointed very well is that energy transition plants are requiring huge amounts of metals and diverse type of metals. And if we actually look at what is mined today of these strategic metals and what these scenarios require us to mine, and I would like to challenge, these are scenarios, and we should not make it into facts. These are scenarios we should challenge these narratives and make them possible scenarios. And actually, as Annabelle was pointing, I think they are challenging scenarios because it's really difficult to, in a very short time frame, to actually be able to open new mines that would be able to supply with many of these strategic metals. Copper is one of the most demanded metals, but actually it's quite mined globally. But some of these metals are not that much mined and would require the opening of new mines and the intensification of existing mines. This is a global distribution of reserves and extraction. I won't go into detail, but I just would like to mention that beyond, we should also challenge this map because many conflicts are actually happening in Europe and areas that actually don't look as strategic, but pressures to access these metals and minerals is so huge that there's a global pressure to extract all type of mines everywhere. If we look at the atlas, I can share a PowerPoint so you can explore. This graph is part of a report that I will mention now that you can access and see with later. These are the mining conflicts that we have today in the atlas. Each one of these orange points are conflicts, and not only related to transition minerals, also gold, silver, which actually can also be considered somehow relevant in energy transition. As you can see, and I was saying before, some areas look under mapped, here in China, Russia, Africa, Australia. So this is a working process. We actually just when we are now doing focusing on a specific area, which is Latin America, to improve the atlas and try to conduct some research that tries to understand some of the trends of how energy transition related minerals are being mined in Latin America and the conflicts that are emerging from these pressures. And we just launched in November, and I here put the link, a feature map that was developed with communities mobilized against lithium, copper, graphite, and yes, these three strategic metals, nickel and others are really, if you see in the previous map, you can see that Latin America is a strategic region for actually lithium, copper, graphite. And we did a mapping of conflicts in Latin America, and sorry, in the Americas. We did this with the Mining Watch Canada and more than 50 social organizations and the researchers from the Americas, and we focused in 9 countries, in the Canada, US, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Panama, and Mexico. And we mapped with these movements their conflicts, and we made these interactive maps so they could show regionally what was happening in terms of conflicts. And if you click here in any of these points, you can access and read in more detail the struggles, what are the struggles about, who are the actors, what are they doing, what's happening, which are the corporations involved in this conflict. So I invite you to check and visit the website. And here you can access a report where we focus in 25 cases, and we try to see which are the main impacts and main demands, the main narratives or corporations of and governments. And if you access the feature map, you will see more information about this research. Something that we found is that how, sorry, I cannot read. Something that we found is that we created in this interactive map, we added some layers. So you can actually see how these conflicts overlap, which one of these points is a conflict against a mining project, overlaps with areas with water risk and also protected areas. And what we found, and it's a concern of social movements, is how this green mining boom is rapidly expanding into culturally and ecologically sensitive areas, Ramsar areas, and poor known ecosystems like salt flats, hotspots. You can see in the report how we illustrate how this transition mineral mining pressure is going into very sensitive areas where also indigenous communities live. There is also protected species at risk. So we try to highlight a certain number of challenges that are emerging from this mining pressure. And let me see. And there's a point that maybe is not very well illustrated in the map that I would like to stress, but it's also part of the narrative of local movements. So here you have two pictures of mobilizations, one in Canada and the other in Argentina, in the bottom and in the top of the Americas. And on the right, what you can see here is a map that was built by social movements in Argentina, showing not individual projects and conflicts, but how there is a challenge that has to do with the aggregated number of projects that are putting at stress social, indigenous communities, vulnerable social groups, but also different ecosystems. So there is also a challenge here when we look at the different conflicts and these projects, is this aggregated pressure on ecosystems that is not only putting at risk water sources, like this is the case in the Salar del Hombre Muerto, where they extract lithium from the salt flats, means they need to extract the water to extract the lithium from the water. So it's actually it's like water mining in the case of this type of lithium mines. But it's also in the case of the Amazons, where we also have cases, and the cloud forests. We should also ask ourselves if we are putting at risk ecosystems that actually have a function regulating the climate. And I think here it would be quite dangerous if all the policies that we are and activities we are pushing to actually mitigate and address climate change will actually make it more worse, because we will be affecting climate regulation functions. And I think this is something is happening in the Amazons, with many activities have been including mining in the Amazons. And this is a question maybe we need more research to see the type of risk we are facing. Okay, so there's all this mobilization. Yes.
Can I ask you to start to summarize?
Yes. So I wanted to show you the question about what type of transformations are these movements, or can these movements foster? So from the global analysis of the Atlas, what we found is that actually there is evidence that environmental defenders can be powerful global forces for environmental protection and actually foster more just and sustainable resource use. These are some of the outcomes that we found for all the database, like strengthening of participation, how some projects were affected, and how there's negotiated alternative solutions from that result from this conflict, and also some poor outcomes. I just would like quickly to mention a very relevant case, a very interesting case, which is the case of Argentina, where we can see how social mobilization in relation to mining has led to very profound institutional and social transformations. And this is a publication, you can read later if you want. But if you look at the different outcomes, these are 38 conflicts, mining conflicts in Argentina. These are when we built specifically with Lucrecia Wagner a database identifying all large-scale mining and mineral conflicts in Argentina, which were 38. And what we found is that actually more than half of the projects involved in these conflicts were stopped by social movements. And this is quite unique when you look at any process of mobilization in the Atlas. Not only that, this capacity to stop and challenge these activities, but also they did something very unique as they foster institutional change. 9 out of 23 national provinces in Argentina actually have laws that were fostered by social movements that restrict large-scale metal mining. So currently, these social movements across Argentina have succeeded to make mining more difficult in the country and less attractive for investors, which is now a big challenge for many mining plans that actually national governments and provincial governments want to put forward. There is also a very interesting outcome in terms of strengthening of participation, but we also see an increasing in the criminalization and repression of social environmental movements. That is happening globally, but in Argentina it's more recent and we see it more and more common. So I won't go too deep into this, but what we have found trying to understand this capacity of this social mobilization in Argentina to trigger institutional change and social transformations is we found very interesting evidence from the mobilization dynamics, the different actors that were working together, the diversity of strategies they were using, legal, but also in terms of public mobilization and other type of strategies you can check in the paper, but also how they work in networks. They had multi-scalar networks and they moved as a collective actor, supporting each other and sharing and learning together about strategies, but also mining, and becoming very efficient and effective in creating a national debate and also being able to foster this institutional change. But what I think is interesting is that all this social movement is going beyond the mining debate. If you see what's happening in Argentina, but also in other countries, this social mobilization is also fostering going beyond mining issues and fostering social, political, and institutional change, pushing for broader environmental regulations and align with other type of environmental conflicts and movements. So I wanted to share this, thank you all, and I wanted to share this different research that you can check and read in more detail that I think is interesting to think about environmental conflicts broadly, but also think about the challenges of actually putting all these mining pressures to actually be able to extract all these metals. These social movements are becoming a real challenge to these global scenarios.
So, thank you very much. I go back, and I hope Peter allow me a little bit more time than expected because the presentation spent a little bit, just so I can kind of finalize the presentation with some reflections, trying to link this with ideas about transformation. So let me just, what this discussion and the presentations of Peter and Mariana are shown very clearly is that we need radical and significant transformations. So basically, in relation to that, I think that there are 3 important questions that we should be looking at when thinking about the kind of transformations that we need. One is about the ambitions, the kind of scale and scope that we should be looking at. The other is the model or theories of change, which Peter kind of mentioned a little bit, and Marianne as well. And then which kind of evidence and what the evidence is telling us about these possibilities of transformation. In terms of the ambitions and the scale, the thing that we need to, in a way, think about is, should we focus on the mining sector, just narrowly, trying to understand how to promote changes in the sector? Should we focus on the links, interlinks between the mining and other sectors, as it was clearly suggested, probably a more promising avenue? Or we should focus on the whole growth model in which mining sector is inserted? And of course, we can look at all of these scales, but the question is whether there are contradictions or conflicts when we just focus on one of them and leave the others aside, and which kind of conflicts are created by For example, we just try to think about how to make mining kind of a cleaner activity, what it means in terms of thinking a broader transition. The second question that I raised that is about the theories of change is important because, of course, if we think that market forces are important, then we will be looking at issues like, for example, how to make consumers to promote or consume products that use processes that are cleaner in terms of mining extraction, or we will be interested in trying to understand how we can make companies to change their behaviors and their investments. Also, for example, how financial capital, financial markets may promote different kinds of investments. If we believe in institutions and policies, we will be interested in trying to understand which kind of regulations or which kind of policies might kind of solve the market failures that at the moment are limiting transformations or transitions in this industry. If we have a kind of more evolutionary perspective, we will be looking at issues of knowledge, the kind of knowledge opportunities or the kind of path dependencies that the existing knowledge creates and limit transformation. And of course, if we believe in institutions have a kind of more evolutionary perspective, we will try to understand which kind of policies can promote new knowledge or the new necessary knowledge for these transformations, that the kind of things that Peter was mentioning. Then, of course, we can think that market forces are not the most important, and policies cannot address all the problems, and that there are important non-market forces that are we should be considering in terms of understanding transformations and transition of the kinds of the processes that Mariana was mentioning. And then, of course, there are questions about how we think all this, even if we think that all these forces are important, we need to understand how we think they interact between each other in more or less chaotic ways in terms of the kinds of process that we are predicting or we should be studying or we should be promoting. And so, of course, there are many things, but the evidence that is already available can help us to choose and see where there are the most promising avenues or directions of research. And very clearly, the evidence is showing, as we understand, that the market forces are not working in the mining sector very well. This is a sector where the product is an input for other products, so the final consumers are very distant from the production sites, are not so sensitive of what's happening there. The product is a commodity, so the enterprises compete more for prices and are looking for efficiency. The financial markets might be a way to go, but they are not. We are not seeing still very interesting developments there. In terms of regulation, interesting also that in general we have big expectations about what regulations might do. In this sector, what we can see is that there are kind of failures that because of the power imbalances between these large companies that also are mobile and the government, the regulations are not being very effective in terms of changing radically the technologies or the processes, and then we have very problematic situations emerging, like, for example, the accident recently in Brumadinho because of the failures in the regulation. In terms of technological opportunities also, this is something that we have studied very well for some time. There are, of course, very interesting new technology and knowledge opportunities that can be helpful in terms of transforming the sector, like, for example, new biotech or IT or artificial intelligence that could be used to improve the processes. But in the context of these market failures and institutional failures, what we can see is that these are not being applied really by the large companies in the scale that we will need. And one part of the explanation is also that this is a sector typically driven, where innovation is driven by suppliers. So, and these markets of suppliers are very concentrated, and because of the shape that these markets have adopted, there are very little changes. So, the only place that it seems that there are some things happening is around non-market forces. And so the good news is that, that we could kind of start, we should focus on that, we think, and try to see how to promote or start to promote transformations and think about transformations around this sector. And so Mariana explained it very well and give a very good picture of what is happening. But and this is something that has been studied very much. But what we think is important is to try to understand a bit better how these kind of conflicts and social movements might, which role they might play in transformation. It's important that we understand how the actions, or how we make sense of the actions and the impacts of these social movements in a broader picture, and how interact with other forces of change in terms of explaining or possibilities of explaining broader changes. So that's something that we think should be done in terms of exploring better the potential, the transformative potential of social movements. And in that sense, we have started to do some work trying to make sense and to connect the kind of this driving force of change with other forces. This is very preliminary, but basically here we can see that they can kind of either disrupt existing practices, or they can be contributing to the creation of new ideas and new practices. They could affect directly regulations, like Mariana was telling, but they could also affect business directly, or they could affect consumers directly through affecting public opinion. And all this could happen at the local scale, but could also happen at the global scales, and the links between global and local, they have been studied a little bit, but we should understand much better how these links might work to provide that to become a more powerful force of change. And of course, all of this is affecting new ideas and new about development and new business models. And this is something that we have started to see very strongly. And interestingly, we think that this can create a dynamic of positive change, because to the extent that we have different ideas about development that are becoming more spread, then the actions of the social movement are more meaningful within a broader picture, or within other ideas about development, and might have more and more impact. We have seen started to see some examples that I'm not going to go to because we don't have time, but there are very interesting examples of things happening all around this map. And the idea we have is that we should try to understand much better what is happening. So to finish, energy transitions need to consider these development tensions that we were talking about, particularly in low and middle income countries. These increasing tensions demand urgent changes. In mining, what we can see is that the traditional forces of change are not working, and even the non-traditional but accepted forces because of the failures. And so the non-market forces are the ones that probably are more promising, and we should be trying to understand much more and trying to connect them with others to have a bigger picture, to integrate them, but to have a bigger picture, and also to be able to have conversations between different kinds of stakeholders and views, and with different approaches. So I will leave it here and open up for discussion. And sorry for taking more time than the one we thought.
Great, thank you so much, Annabelle, Peter, and Mariana. That was a really fascinating, and I guess quite, in some ways, quite distressing presentation. I think, Mariana, the atlas and the findings that you've got is really highlighting the scale and the depth of conflict which is associated with mining intensification. However, and as Annabelle has just commented on at the end, it's also very encouraging, I think, to see actions, collective mobilization, which is not only happening, but also apparently in the number of cases actually making a difference to outcomes, which is really interesting. And Annabelle, you sort of rounded it up really, I think, connecting back to some of the kind of the quandaries and the kind of big conundrum that Pete raised early as a possible agenda for thinking forward about how to understand this better. So I think it's been a really fascinating talk so far. We've got about half an hour now to open it up for conversation. And we have quite a lot of questions and comments, and actually a discussion going on in the chat, which is very good. So what I'd like to do is just perhaps to sort of run through some of the themes. And I must say, just to say too, that there's some strong appreciation for what you've all contributed today, and also a question about whether it'd be possible to get copies of the slides afterwards, which I hope would be feasible, because there would be some interest in probably having a bit more time to take a look at those and to reflect on them. So just in terms of a few of the questions and points which have been raised, two questions were posted quite early on, and I think in some ways, as you all continued, you actually addressed some of these to some extent. The first one was the point that in view of the old Malthusian debate on productivity, do you think that technology and innovation can save us, considering the massive economic incentives to address the productivity gap? So I think as you spoke, to some extent you addressed that. And also the second part of that question, which I think Mariana spoke about particularly, is what is the political implication for poor resource-rich countries, and what's the impact from global pressure for more natural resources on democracy and participation? So I think actually, Mariana, to some extent, you spoke to that. Perhaps one thing I'll just add to that is maybe when we get your responses, Mariana, particularly, you shared some case studies at the end, and I think it'd be very interesting perhaps to share your thoughts about how can you extrapolate from what's happening in those individual cases? Can you imagine that the lessons that you're seeing in specific contexts may also shed light on what happens in terms of collectivization and mobilization and participation elsewhere? So that's one, those are two questions that came early. And then the other one I want to bring to you to get your responses. There's a very interesting sort of strand of debate in the chat, and I think, Annabelle, you talked about this towards the end as well, about the coming together of mining and extraction and development. So perhaps if I just run through a few of the observations. Carlotta actually said very well something that was striking me. We do seem to be in a very serious bind. We want to save the planet, and there's a need for minerals. But if we produce the minerals, we harm the planet and the people. So do you see a solution? What are the options? And she asked the question, would it be possible to turn mining projects into local development projects? Then we get into a little bit more of the discussion in the chat that also talks about the pace of change. So the acceleration of this intensification is really significant. There's a really strong push for access to these minerals, and yet there's a really strong push back, which is leading to conflict. And there's that sense of an accelerating timeline where there's a desire to deliver on sustainable development, but at the same time, multiple contestations and interactions between different actors, stakeholders, citizens, communities around these issues. So, again, another question that was raised is it, for example, possible, are there any dynamics around the involvement of domestic or regional mining companies or transnational companies in relation to the increase in mining related conflicts? And what could be the potential role for more locally centered mining development, which perhaps connects with forms of economic and social development which are within that context, rather than these being driven by global multinationals and major global corporations. So, and then the final point, which I'll just raise before I come back to you, is basically then questioning the whole idea of growth. So, it's Robert has said his take is, in order to save the planet, we need to change the economic system. So I think if, Annabelle, you also spoke to this earlier, and Peter, when we stop overproducing, overconsuming, overgrowing, overmarketizing, and adopt a convivial society ideal, we may not and we won't need as many minerals as we think we do. So how do we challenge the concept of growth for growth's sake, because otherwise we're just going to keep bringing solutions that won't solve the core problem, that essentially we just need more growth, and that mining is going to help us to deliver that. So these are some of the thoughts which have already been shared. Some of them are big questions around, development and concepts of growth and the role of mining and intensification, the timelines, the urgent need to move forward, whilst also recognizing that resolution, collective movements, social mobilization take time. So I think maybe if I can come to you first, Mariana, I think just to choose any of these points that you'd like to go with. Don't feel you have to respond to all. There are some more questions and comments coming in the chat as well. So I think let me just invite you to share any reflections on some of those broad ideas.
Thank you, Peter. These are indeed big questions that I think need to be discussed further. Of course, the Argentinian case or Latin American case has some particularities because the continent shares a language, so it's easier to have networks that learn together and challenge together certain narratives and think together about alternatives. So we want to advance now in similar mappings in other regions of the world, like in Africa and Asia, which you are welcome to join in this effort if any of you is interested. And of course, there will be different contexts, different political opportunity structures, different actors. So we should see which are the specific processes in different parts of the world. But I think what is interesting from the case in Latin America and the case of Argentina is how these social movements and these networks work together, and they actually get to change the political opportunity structures, create new regulations, new institutions, and also challenge the cultural way we look at mining. Mining is very difficult to do it at the community level, from the community, an activity led by communities because of the size. We are talking here about large-scale mines that require lots of investments, the removal of thousands of tons of rock that is processed, the generation of large amounts of waste that are difficult to treat and to conceal in the long term. So there's many environmental challenges and social impacts related to large-scale mining. So it's really difficult to involve communities in these activities. And what is happening is that many of these mining frontier is arriving to communities that actually had a marginal role in climate change as emitters. So these communities that had a marginal role in creating the climate change are actually now becoming like the sacrifice communities in the name of energy transition. So this is a huge justice issue that we should also consider. And when I was saying challenging scenarios is when we look at the energy transition scenarios and we look at the materials required for a car, can we challenge the transport system, for instance? Do we actually need individual cars for everybody? Can we challenge the way we look at these scenarios in a way that, as Peter was mentioning in the beginning, we don't just keep on doing what we are doing the same way, just shifting the type of energy source. So I think this is why communities actually asking this. So it's not only about mining, but mining for what, mining for whom, mining at what cost. So I think these are questions that we need to raise, also taking in mind the injustices. We are putting pressure on communities that actually are quite sustainable in the way they live and they relate to the environment. Not all, of course, but many of these. So I think these are interesting questions to bring to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Mariana. Pete, let me come back to you, because now you've also had the luxury of listening to Mariana and Annabelle after you gave your input, and now in light of these questions, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, these are all fantastic questions. I mean, maybe go to Carlotta's one, because it sort of seems to pick up on lots of different strands, like how do we get out of this bind that we seemingly need minerals to decarbonize and to accelerate sustainable transitions, but that in turn creates other problems. I mean, I think, as Mariana was just saying, actually, my point would be to start with demand reduction, because a lot of it is about about planning around reducing waste, about circular economies, which I've seen other people have mentioned in the chat, reuse, repair, reducing the demand. And as Mariana was just saying, I mean, the problem with the drive for EV is we're assuming a model of auto mobility, that, you know, everyone has to have their own individual car and it has to be electric. Well, we would, if far more forms of transportation were public and you had a few electric buses and not dozens and dozens of cars, then the demand for those minerals would significantly reduce. So there's a range of ways of getting at this. Clearly, you also need proper regulation around planned obsolescence and improving the life of batteries and all those sorts of things. I think there's a big role for supply chain responsibility, industrial policy, tax, all of those sorts of things to put pressure on all sides on companies. And someone else, I think, had a question in the chat around who should set those standards, like where does the duty of care lie? And some work we did when I was at IDS, actually, so it's a very long time ago now, was thinking that issue through, like trying to put more of the responsibility and duty of care on the home country, so that as companies, including of course here mining companies, operate overseas, they're expected to adopt similar social environmental standards wherever they operate. In other words, it's not okay to lower your production standards when you operate overseas and leave waste legacies or, you know, poor working conditions, etc. So I think there really is a big role to play in, you know, foreign direct liability or other ways of trying to extend the duty of care through the supply chain to different parts of the world. Maybe I can just take one or two of the other questions. Julia, I think, asked about the time and speed and whether this is intensifying pressures. I think it is. And another important point related to this is the way in which the boom is being fueled. And this, you know, coming back to Carlotta really and all her work on the role of finance capital. This is what finance does, right? You create a boom and an excitement around a new area of investment or a new accumulation opportunity. And that's exactly what's going on here. And there needs to be some regulation of who is bankrolling and funding some of these things, and some better regulation of that, because the speed and the drive is intensifying some of these conflicts. And what that does, just to pick up finally on one of the other questions, is that does narrow civic space and participation, because the rush to capitalize on these opportunities means governments are nervous about having citizen engagements and consultations, or having to think through seriously what might be the liability mechanisms if this goes wrong. They don't want to hear that. There's this big boom and this big rush to sort of capitalize on this renewed interest. And that absolutely has the effect of closing down civic engagement in certain spaces. And that's a big problem.
Thanks, Peter. Annabelle, let me come back to you. And just to say too that in the chat, there's quite a lot of sharing of resources, which is really good. So, you know, if anyone is sort of keen to do further reading on this, and also to look at a number of websites, which I think have really interesting sort of frameworks and data and analysis, there's some really good links there in the chat. So just to highlight that, to give everybody a chance to check those out. Annabelle.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I will pick up on some of the issues as well, because there are so many and some of them have been addressed. So one of them, the first one that I think nobody addresses, about the role of technology. Technology will save us. Well, no, because actually some of these new technologies are there in theory that will allow things to really take different directions, but this is not happening. So the big question is about why companies are not adopting them. Actually, for example, in Argentina, we find out, looking at the reports of environmental impact done by the companies that could not advance with a big silver project that is called Navidad. And they made a proposal to do it without the use of cyanide. And it was more expensive for the company, but they, to begin with, they didn't propose it to do it without cyanide. So the question is why? I mean, we don't have the mechanism. Why the company just always use in the planifications the technology that assure the maximize profits, and we don't have any mechanism to assure that we have accountability, that we know the options, that the people can evaluate, that we have multi-criteria, and so on. So many things that are more related to practices than to the hard technologies. In many cases, the possibilities are there, but the companies just choose whatever they want and nobody control them. There are issues of asymmetrical information and many other issues. So I will say that the core thing is not hard technologies, is the social and institutional practices and how we can start to change them. The other question about the scale, the scale of the mining that several people mentioned it, and I think Mariana addressed in part this, and it's true that many of these require large scales, but it's also true like in many other sectors, you have a learning process and that have taken you to the place where we are now, all these issues that I was describing before. So at some point, we also, at some point in a different project, we tried to understand if there were, or trying to look for alternatives, small scale, and actually it's true, there were very little, but there were some, and the value of these projects probably is not so much what they can deliver now in terms of quantity of material, but the value is about learning, and learning to do things in a different way. And in that sense, for example, in Argentina, again, we found a very interesting case of golden by a company that is small, a small company that is producing without chemicals. And it's a very interesting, it's a state, a community, and a private partnership, which we are trying to understand a bit better. But again, the value is about learning of this. And finally, I want to address the issue of the timing and the ambition in a way that come up in several questions. And I think there it's very important to distinguish the kind of global question that I think Peter and Mariana addressed very well. And of course, the kind of things that we should be discussing if we really want to address the problem, that is to change the way in which we transport and so on. But we also have the regional and short-term question, and we need to be able to provide some answers, because government in countryside have been advising the Argentinian government, for example, 2 years ago, and they have to take decisions. They have a big community saying no to mining, and they have big commitments. They have they feel that they need this investment, that they need to increase exports and so on. Obviously, with the frame and the ideas about growth that are dominant now, but still. And so I think it's important to distinguish the kind of ideas that we have about the future, but from the processes. And probably the focus should be on the kind of processes that we should put in place to start to move things in a different directions. And in that sense, the kind of democratic or anything that can help to take decisions in a different way and distribute power, but also the kind of much more strongly respect for diversity and have diversity much better understood within the models that we have about change. This is something that is very important, I think. So I leave here.
Great, thanks, Annabelle, and thanks to Mariana and Peter as well for your responses. In the chat again, there's some really interesting sharing of ideas and concepts and reading relating to that sort of rethinking growth, the circular economy, revisiting this whole notion of demand and the implications, of then what happens in many countries around the world, which I think is worth taking a look at for everyone. But perhaps just I can take two of the questions, and one is for Mariana, I think I'll bring to, and then the other for Annabelle and Peter. So Mariana, Martin has asked the question, and I think it builds on some of what's just been said, but perhaps it also again connects to some of the findings that you're finding from the case studies. Do you think it would be a more effective approach to regulate mining companies from their base countries, so through requiring them to follow impact assessment processes, maybe listed on financial exchanges, or is it better to support and promote countries where the minerals are being extracted to develop their own regulatory governance capacities, or is it both, or something different? Again, perhaps what are you seeing, from the research you're carrying out about where, if this is the kind of the more of the shorter term approach, I think responding to what Annabelle has just said, where is the main focus of that effort? Where does it need to sort of fall in terms of regulatory capacity and following that through? So that's Mariana. I'll bring to you, and then for Annabelle and Peter, Eva has asked. Well, she's interested in hearing more about the concepts of a just transition that you're thinking about. How do you conceptualize that? And what kind of metrics are you using to measure the distribution of the burdens and the benefits linked to transitions? Or are you looking at in terms of how other actors are thinking about it? Yeah, perhaps you could say a little bit more about that. Mariana, can I come to you first? What's your view about where to focus the efforts in relation of regulation? What are we learning from community mobilization, and what's arising out of conflict settings?
It's a difficult question. I just quickly say that some some social movements involved in conflicts had gone to home countries, to Canada, or for oil corporations, for instance, for the London Stock Exchange, at the level of the stock exchange, at the level of the corporation. They have even, in the case of Chevron Texaco, gone to stakeholder meetings. There's a large part of activism strategies that aim to actually engage or try to influence. It's been not really effective, I would say. But I do think there is a change and an opportunity now. One of the big problems with mining is that it's really difficult you extract copper and to see where this copper goes. It has been really not very transparent and very obscure. But now, when you look at some very strategic metals, actually end users like car builders are part of the mines, are actually go and have direct contracts with the mines because they need that lithium for their batteries. So now there's an opportunity, and there has been an interesting report by Human Rights Watch, actually linking bioxide mining with the car builders in Europe, saying now that these corporations are getting more, that it's more clear to see how some car builders, for instance, are being have a more direct relation with mines. There is an opportunity to actually ask these car builders or end users of the metals to have a more transparent and accountable way of, policy. So actually you can, communities, Mining Watch was claiming, Human Rights Watch, who should can go to the corporation and actually ask for accountability for the way the metals are being mined. So I think now there is something that is changing in the way of there are new opportunities of how communities can actually connect with the end users of the materials that are extracted. And this is quite new. Was really difficult for social movements in the past because it was really obscure to make the connection.
Great, thanks. And that gives some hope and optimism, actually, I think, that opportunity. So that's an encouraging finding and observation. Thanks. So Annabelle and Peter, I'm going to come to you, and this will probably be the last word. If you can say a little to us about just transitions and just how you're thinking about this, and then I'll just add there's a final question from Fayal, which I think is an interesting one, and it's basically how do you actually promote environmental sustainability when there are so many conflicting interests? So perhaps as you talk about just transitions, you might give us a little bit of hope and optimism whilst also recognizing the challenges. And how do you navigate through all the interests, the power, the politics, and the conflicts and the vested interests to try to find a way forward to promoting just transitions? Peter, shall I come to you first? And then
okay. So, of course, this is going to sound like an academic answer because the concept of just transition means different things to different people, but it's true. And that's an important point because one element of it is about procedural justice, right? Like who gets to define what is to be transitioned? What's at stake here? Is it this sort of narrower framing of we need to plug in a different technology, or are you enabled to have a bigger conversation about energy pathways or livelihoods or labour conditions and those sorts of things? That's a really important point about the procedural, who gets consulted about this, who's involved in the key decisions. That's absolutely a crucial element of just transition. But then there's also the distributional side that we're talking about here, who captures the rent, the value, who pays the sacrifice. All of those elements are part of a just transition. It often gets talked about in quite a labour-centred way, like the International Labour Organization, other actors have been, understandably quite central to these discussions. So it's often been about just jobs, as in, can we have green jobs that are also well paid and secure jobs? But there are broader notions of just transition that are trying to think about, a broader range of stakeholders than the sort of narrower negotiations between trade unions and corporations. So it's a really good question. So there's a lot of literature on that. I'm happy to share it with you if you want to send me an email afterwards. But it does very much sort of relate to those issues. And someone else asked a question actually about the state, and I think the state is really important. So some of the more successful just transitions, like away from gas in the Netherlands or out of coal in Germany, for example, there's been conscious effort to think about compensation, about retraining, about redevelopment plans. And so maybe to answer your point, Peter, I think that's one of the key things about the more optimistic scenarios, like, can you build an attractive, viable alternative, working with different groups to come up with an alternative vision? Because I think what's often happens in these spaces is it's this or nothing. It's either you have this mine or you'll be poor, and there's no discussion around, well, what if we constructed the economy a different way, or what if we had an alternative regional redevelopment plan that looked like this, or what if the state was actually able to capture some of these taxes and reinvest them in other jobs, or so it's partly a question of framing and political imagination that there are viable alternatives, and always making the connections to things like health and justice and security and these broader things that bring people in, so that you do get these coalitions to sort of mobilize change. I think that would be my answer to that question.
Thanks, Peter. And I'll just turn to Annabelle, but I guess my observation too, of course, is this is a question for every country and for everyone, isn't it? It's not just countries who might have been perceived in the past as being, having greater instances of poverty or more excluded from, sort of global markets and so on. Here in our own backyard, we're also grappling with these same kinds of issues, and we also have a collective and shared responsibility to be part of these debates as well. So yeah, absolutely, really important points. Thanks. Annabelle, to you.
Yeah. Okay. So Peter already kind of explained the concepts and the ideas about just transition. Just in my case, to add, coming where I come from, I've been interested, I've been working in the issue of mining and the impact of mining and so in low and middle income countries. The idea of just transition, it was very instrumentally for me. It's useful in the sense that help us to give a sense of urgency, to be looking at these issues that have been taking place for a long time. Mariana has been studying the issue of the impacts on social movements and the struggles for a long time. And the kind of idea of just energy transition, I think, is interesting in the sense that it helps to give a sense of urgency to look at these issues that have been there for a long time in the mining sector and in other sectors. And so for me, it's very useful in terms of helping to bring some things to the top of the agenda, that everybody is looking at that, and not just the people that is interested in development or in the impact of it in these countries. Because if these things are not addressed, then what happened with the transition that everybody wants, and nobody wants that this transition is unjust. So it's very useful for me, this idea in this sense, and we should use it to raise these issues, and we are doing it. And then the last point about the kind of trade-off and the complications of the I think again, I think Peter mentioned many of the important things that for me as well. Just to mention there that is, I think that in a way, these kind of tensions that we are seeing every time more should force us to rethink many things. But one of them that, for example, I'm very much thinking now is the issue of policies when we discuss about science and technologies or industrial or productive, like you say in Spanish, and we never translate very well to English, but policies that are for the productive sector. We are very used to all the discussions about which sectors, which are the best sectors, where we should invest in low and middle income countries to kind of diversify our economies and so on. But in this context, I think that probably we should pay much more attention and understand much better the kind of negotiation capacities that we need in terms of addressing these issues. And it's not very much on this kind of discussion, how to handle all these policies involve huge and significant tensions. And there is a lot of discussion about participation and involvement of citizens and so on, but in kind of more marginal spaces. What happens when you really have to take decisions that involve interest of powerful groups, or decisions that are really have to do with the bigger economic issues? And then we have very little really in terms of what to do to really have the space for these the negotiation processes that should be involved in these big important decisions. And so I think this is probably an area we should work much more, and personally I'm very interested in the context of this discussion, for example.
Great. Thank you so much, Annabelle. And with that, we come to the end of what's been a really fascinating and a very big discussion. Lots of interest, clearly, amongst those who joined us to continue it. And I think there'll be some follow-up and some further conversations about this. Reading material in the chat. The recording of this lecture will be available on the IDS website. So please share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend this evening. Just to say too, the next Sussex Development Lecture will be on the 10th of February with Professor Laila Mehta and Dr. Shilpi Srivastava from IDS and their fellow authors of a new open access book on the politics of climate change and uncertainty in India. So that's something also to look forward to. But for now, let me thank everybody who has joined, our IDS colleagues in the back room who have facilitated all of this and made it happen extremely successfully, and most particularly to Annabelle, Peter and Mariana for sharing your thoughts on a complex topic, but I think also giving us some grounds for optimism of a different future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.